Good morning. I'd like to call the regular board meeting of the HART to order. Will everyone please rise to the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
First of all, let me wish everyone a Happy New Year. And to the board, we have a long agenda this morning, and then we have a meeting after this meeting to deal with the recruitment of our new CEO. So be ever mindful that we don't want to be here until this afternoon. So just want to say that as we get started this morning. First of all, we're going to recognize one of our outgoing members, Council Member Sherry Donahue. Councilman Donahue was appointed to the HART Board of Directors in December 2016 as a representative of the mayor of the city of Temple Terrace, and since then was reappointed for an additional one-year term in 2017. During her tenure on the HART Board of Directors, Councilwoman Donahue was an active participant in many employee functions, transit rider groups, and community outreach events. Councilwoman Donahue held several positions on many HART Board committees and other boards, such as the Transportation Disadvantaged Coordinating Board, HART ADA Task Force, Tampa Streetcar Board of Directors, Governance Administration Operation Committee, Finance and Audit Committee. HART would like to thank Ms. Councilwoman Donahue for her dedicated service and present her with this beautiful crystal bust.
With me as interim CEO and CFO, you know this is not Crystal. You know this is not Crystal. Thank you for your 2 years of service. We did some great things. We got service back in Temple Terrace.
That's right.
We're addressing some issues on safety and concerns with our shelters there. So with this, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It has been a pleasure working with you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I know you have a long agenda, so I'll leave my 19-page summary at my seat. One of the main differences that I see in this agency is that it has definitely gone from a bus agency, a transit agency, to a mobility agency, and that is inspiring to me. And it's based on the work of the citizens who have been appointed, and obviously on the backs of the employees who work for us. So thank you so much. You haven't lost an advocate, you've gained another one. You eventually, now you'll have two from the third largest city in the county, Temple Terrace. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Donahue, for your service. We do appreciate it very, very much. And we'd like to welcome a new board member, Councilman Gil Schisler. Pronounced that right?
Yes, okay. Perfect.
Councilman Schisler was elected to the Temple Terrace City Council on November 6, 2018. Mr. Schisler retired from Daniels Education Corporation as CFO and HR Director in 2015. He is currently the owner of GCS Financial Consulting, LLC, a local accounting service for small businesses, and treasurer of the Board of Terrace Community Middle School. Prior to his election to City Council, Mr. Schisler served in many capacities in the City of Temple Terrace, such as on the Board of Adjustment, School and Improvement Task Force, as a founding board member of the Terrace Community Middle School, on the TTGCC Advisory Committee, as an Orange River Homeowners Association board member, assisting with the Temple Terrace Little League, and with other various local school site groups. Mr. Schisler, welcome aboard. Do you have anything you want to say, sir?
I just look forward to working with the board.
Very good.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Glad to have you. Thank you very much. We're now moving to the approval of the minutes from the December 3rd meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved.
There's a motion to approve the minutes and a second. Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor, let it be known by saying aye. Aye. Opposed likewise. Motion is adopted. Public input on agenda items. We have 3 people signed up for agenda items. First of all is Rick Fernandez.
Great, thank you. Hope I haven't messed up your storyboard here. Good morning, everyone, and Happy New Year. My name is Rick Fernandez, 2906 North Eldmore in Tampa Heights. I'm president of the Tampa Heights Civic Association, and I'm privileged to serve on the MPO CAC, compliments of Commissioner Miller's appointment. I'm here today to speak on item 6 Bravo of your agenda, seeking appointment to the Independent Oversight Committee. Several of you I've known, some for years. Some of you, you don't know me from Adam's house cat, so I thought it might make some sense to at least come and introduce myself and express my interest in the appointment. My application is among a group of 13 qualified individuals in your backup materials. There's also a bio sheet circulating that I think some of you have. I submitted it via email to the staff, and some of you received copies directly from me. And if anybody needs a copy, I'll leave a small stack with Council Smith here. The IOC has at least 2 very important goals and jobs to do. One is very obvious, oversight and audit function, which has painstakingly been described in the amendment document. The other is less obvious perhaps, but no less important, and that has to do with the element of credibility and trust that the presence of the Oversight Committee provides to the entire endeavor. I was frankly surprised when going through the petition process and securing signatures on petitions at the number of people that commented on the Independent Oversight Committee, and in fact found that element of the proposal very important in closing the sale, if you will, to have them even sign the petition. No big surprise that trust is not in very high supply in government. The idea that citizens would be available to provide an extra set of eyes and ears to make sure that money was going to be distributed and spent in the right way was very important to folks. So it is important that we deliver on those 2 goals, that we accomplish those 2 jobs. I'm here today because I think by way of education, training, and experience over 40 years, I can provide, along with a team, a way to advance these goals and get these jobs done. It's very important to the city, to the county, and to me personally, and I thank you very much for the opportunity and your time.
Thank you, sir. Next is Mickey Jacob. Remember, everyone, you have 3 minutes.
Good morning, board members, and Mr. Chair, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Mickey Jacob. I live at 450 Knights Run Avenue in Tampa. I'm here today to speak on agenda item 6B, again as a candidate for consideration to be selected to represent HART on the Independent Oversight Committee. I've been practicing architecture in this community for 38 years, and as an architect and as a community leader, I've been dedicated to serving my community to address issues that affect the quality of life, the built environment, public safety, sustainability, resilience, and now the importance of transportation that it plays in our community, which has been a part of my practice for all 38 years, because transportation supports what we do in the built environment. It's critical to its success. I believe my application certainly has my credentials, and I'm not going to belabor those things. I have sought leadership positions both in my profession and the community throughout my professional career, which I think is critically important in the development of people like all of us who want to serve the community to the best of its capacity. Currently, I serve as the chair of the Tampa Downtown Partnership, which is a great responsibility for things that are going on, and I'm proud to be a co-founder of the Downtowner, which is another alternative form of transit that has proven quite successful that we hope to continue to build and implement. With those leadership positions, I was a big, ardent, and vocal supporter of the All for Transportation initiative. And that's because that initiative is a measure critical to the successful, prosperous transportation future of our community. I believe with thoughtful and informed decision-making on the IOC and looking at the measures brought forward by all the entities involved, we can design a plan that meets the growing transportation demands and challenges we face in Hillsborough County. I believe my experience and expertise makes me a qualified candidate for this position, and it also fuels my passion to ensuring the implementation of the surcharge tax maximizes transportation and transit solutions to best serve the healthy mobility future of our community. It would be an honor for me to serve on this. I truly appreciate this, being able to stand before you again today and present my credentials and my passion that the leadership from our community with this committee, the leadership from all of us in making a great, informed, and responsible and thoughtful decisions is going to make our community a better place for all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Jacob. Last speaker is Tony Monk.
My name's Tony Monk. I'm just a citizen. I'm not trying to be on the Oversight Committee. But I'm also not as eloquent. I live at 2507 North Glenwood, and I'm the vice chair of the Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee. The All for Transportation initiative and success has started a dialogue that's a little more apparent in our community, which has been very good. But what I've seen a lot of is our transportation system, our transit, being discussed as a charity, as some thing that we have to provide for poor people and impaired people. And I'd like to see this board perhaps try to change that discussion and educate people about the value of transit. It's a good investment. It's better return on investment than designing for automobile use, as an example. The only thing that's better investment is bike and ped, conveniently. I've read a few quotes from members of this board that are disheartening. And I hope that Mr. Walker will speak a little bit to this. It's a great investment for our community and needs to be treated as such, not as a secondhand charity thing. I'm sure this board understands that, but in addition to your governance of our transit system, we also need to shift the dialogue and educate people about the value of the system. And it's an investment, not a subsidy. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Monk. That was the last speaker I had on the sheet here. Is anyone else wish to address the board? Seeing none, thank you very much. Now move to discussion items, election of HART officers and vote on HART Board of Appointments and other boards and HART Board committees. Mr. Smith.
Good morning and Happy New Year, everyone. I think, several of you have not gone through this process before, so let me give you a little précis of how we do this. There are requirements under the policies for the 3 officers, which we start with the election of 3 officers first. There must be 1 elected county representative. There must be 1 elected representative from the municipalities, and there must be 1 non-elected representative on the board. So we've got 3 offices. We get 1 of each species, if you will, that will serve in that capacity. You've got the information on page 6-1 of your summary for today that shows you what those offices are, who the current officers are. And what I would suggest we do is we start first with nominations from the floor for the chair. Do I see any nominations? Mr. Suarez.
I nominate Commissioner Miller, please.
Second.
Okay. Commissioner Miller. Yes, ma'am.
I nominate Commissioner Pat Kemp for chair.
Yes, ma'am. We have 2 nominations so far from the floor. We have Mr. Miller. We have Ms. Kemp. Are there any further nominations? Seeing none, I will close the floor to nominations, and we need to take a vote. I'd suggest we simply do so by raising hands unless someone has an objection to that. Okay. And I would like to get Lena to assist me in the counting process. There are some people I can't see down here. We've unfortunately had mistakes in our county. So we need to get this correct. All right, so first we'll start with those who would like to vote for the current chair to continue as the chair, Mr. Miller. All in favor, raise your hand. 6, 7, 8. Looks like 8 to me, okay. All those in favor of Ms. Kemp for serving as the chair, raise their hand. Looks like we have 5. So Mr. Miller has been elected your chair for the next year.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Would you like to take over the balance of this now, or you have me? I thought so. Okay.
No way.
We have several boards and committees that are elected by this board to serve in other capacities. And again, the summary of these are in your policies. Oh, I'm sorry, you're right. I'm moving along way too quickly. We need to have a vice chair, and we need to have a secretary. So we haven't finished the officers yet. So I now open the floor for nominations for vice chair.
I'll nominate Melanie Williams.
Okay, Ms. Williams has been nominated. Any further nominations? You raised your hand, are you changing it? Okay. Any further nominations? I see no further nominations. With only one nomination, she's elected. I don't think we need to vote. Okay, congratulations. So we have a Hillsborough County representative, elected representative, excuse me. We have a non-elected representative. The next position has to go to an elected person from a city. We have only two possible candidates. Yes, sir.
I nominate Mike Suarez.
Okay, nomination of Mike Suarez to serve as the secretary.
Second.
Are there any further nominations for the secretary? Seeing none, we'll close the nominations, and Mr. Suarez is our secretary. We now have our slate of officers in compliance with our policies.
I don't know. Do we shift now?
Do we shift now, Dave?
Sorry?
Do we shift now?
Seats.
You're elected. You're now taking over, yes. He's,
No. Meaning that, does he move physically now?
yes.
Yes.
The election is effective immediately. Sorry.
Very good.
Okay, so we'll rearrange the sign.
Ms. Williams,
You can move.
I know it's shocking to you, but you're up here.
Once they move the name tags, you have to move too. So.
And you're in your proper shoes.
Congratulations. It's our version of musical chairs. So.
Congratulations. Continue, Mr. Smith.
Okay, we will continue now with the committee elections. We'll go with the order they're presented in your agenda rather than the order in the policy. The first one is the Claims and Litigation Committee. You have again the summary on page 6-1 that indicates who the current member is and who has expressed interest in serving in that capacity. And so what I would like to do is open the floors for nominations to serve as the current member of the primary member of the Claims and Litigation Committee. Yes, ma'am.
I just have a point of order I'd like to clarify.
Sure.
In terms of the city seats, when you said the municipality seats, what are those seats? Is it just Temple Terrace and?
City of Tampa. We only have two. Plant City's not a member.
Right, and then there's 3 appointees at the city of Tampa?
I believe they have 3 appointees.
And Ms. Williams is one of those appointees,
right?
Correct? So
correct.
she would represent the municipals?
No.
She's not an elected.
Has to be elected.
It must be an elected person?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, policy requires elected county, elected municipality, non-elected representative from wherever.
Okay.
So she's the latter. Not to be diminished. We're now moving forward with the Claims and Litigation Committee. We're open for nominations to serve as the primary member of that committee.
I nominate David Mechanic.
Second.
Okay, we have nomination of David Mechanic to serve as the primary member. Are there any further nominations? Not seeing any, I'll close the nominations and David Mechanic will serve as our primary. We need to elect an alternate. Do I have any nominations from the floor for an alternate to serve in that capacity?
Councilman Gil Schisler.
I'm sorry?
She nominated Councilman Sussman.
Councilman Gil Schisler.
Gotcha, thank you.
I'll nominate Adam Harden.
Okay, we have a nomination of Mr. Gilchrist and a nomination of Mr. Harden. Are there any further nominations from the floor? Seeing none, we'll close the nominations and we'll proceed in the same fashion as we did with the election of the chair. We'll cast your vote by raising your hand, and I'll go in the order in which they were nominated. So what we'll do is all those in favor of electing Mr. Schisler as the person serving as the alternate, please indicate by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Nope. I think we have 5. When I decided. Okay. All those in favor of electing Mr. Harden as the alternate, please raise your hand. Okay, we have Mr. Harden as the alternate. Thank you very much. Moving right along to the HART ADA Committee. Again, on page 6.1, do I have any nominations from the floor for the primary member serving in that committee? The current member is no longer on the board, so yes, sir.
I nominate John Melendez.
Okay. Are there any further nominations for this committee?
I nominate Mary Ellen Smith.
Okay, we have Director Melendez and Director Smith. Any further nominations? Seeing none, we close the nominations. We'll proceed in the same fashion. All in favor of Director Melendez, please indicate by raising your hand. Okay, all in favor of Director... That was belated.
I apologize.
Okay, all right. All in favor of electing Director Smith, please indicate by raising your hand. Okay, with the late raising, et cetera, I believe Director Smith, you are the alternate on the ADA committee.
Mr. Smith?
Yes, sir.
Is it possible that if Mr. Melendez would accept being the current alternate to stay on there? Can we do that?
I'm sorry, that was right. That was the primary we just elected.
Right. Correct.
Mr. Melendez, would you like to comment?
That's what I'd expressed interest in, so.
Okay.
Okay.
That's why I didn't vote for myself, so.
It wasn't your
I saw that.
qualifications that
That's why I
concerned.
asked.
I'm involved in a lot of committees currently, and I'm kind of trying to.
All right.
Yeah.
So I'll open the nominations. Take that as a nomination, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Melendez, to serve as alternate.
Yeah.
Any further nominations?
Hopefully I win this one.
Vote for yourself. Okay. Seeing none further, Mr. Melendez is our alternate. All right, next committee. In your materials on page 6.2, Tampa Historic Streetcar Inc. Board. Again, you see the people who are currently serving and those interested. I'm opening the floor for nominations to the Streetcar Board. Mr. Miller.
I nominate Mr. Mechanic, Commissioner Kemp, and Mr. Hart.
So we got Mr. McLean.
No, Mr. Mechanic.
Kemp.
Mechanic. The guy right there.
David
Oh, Mechanic, I'm sorry. Mechanic, Kemp, and your third one was?
Harden.
Harden and
Okay.
Kemp.
Gotcha. I actually can't hear, it just seems like I can.
So that golf you've been playing.
Okay. Any further nominations from the floor? Not hearing any, and since this is a board that has 3 members, I believe we have the 3 members as the primaries. Okay, we need to open up the floor for nominations for current alternates. I think we have 2 spots. Mr. Miller.
I nominate Councilman Suarez and Commissioner Kemp. I'm still Commissioner Overman.
Okay. So that was Suarez and Kemp?
Suarez and Overman.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
already on the.
Gotcha. Any further nominations? Not seeing any. I think we have our alternates. We can move on to the MPO. Again, you've got the current members and the current alternate. Do I hear any nominations from the floor for the current member primary?
I nominate David Mechanic.
Okay, there's a nomination for David Mechanic. Is there another nomination for the primary? Okay, seeing none, the nominations are closed, and Mr. Mechanic is your primary. He will serve as the current member of the MPO. For alternate, do I have any nominations from the floor for alternate?
I'll nominate Adam Harden.
Okay, we have Adam Harden as a nominee. Any further nominations? Seeing none, the floor is closed. Mr. Harden is your alternate. Transportation and Disadvantage Coordinating Board. 6.2C, open the floor for nominations to the primary.
I nominate John Melendez.
Okay, Mr. Melendez. Are there any further nominations for the primary? Seeing none, the nominations are closed. Mr. Melendez is your primary. For an alternate, floor is open for nominations.
I nominate Councilman Schisler. Is that correct, sir?
That's correct.
Okay, good.
Councilman Schisler is nominated. Are there any further nominations from the floor? Hearing none, the nominations are closed, and Mr. Schisler, Director Schisler, is your alternate. T-BARTA Board, open for nominations. Do I hear any nominations for the T-BARTA primary? Yes, ma'am, sir.
I'd like to nominate Rich McLean.
Mr. McLean. Any further nominations for the primary?
I nominate Kathleen Shanahan.
Okay, nominate Kathleen Shanahan. Any further nominations? Not seeing any. Nominations are closed. We'll proceed in the same fashion. By vote, raising your hand, you will indicate whether you're voting for Mr. McLean or Ms. Shanahan to serve as the T-Bar Board member. All in favor of Mr. McLean, please indicate by raising their hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looks like we have 7, if I'm counting correctly.
Okay. Well,
Is that what you got?
And 7, yeah.
Okay, we have 7 in favor of Mr. McLean. All in favor of Ms. Shanahan, please indicate by raising your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Looks like we have 5. All right, Mr. McLean will serve as the T-Board member. We now need to, do we have an alternate for that? I don't see one listed.
I don't think so.
Okay. Finance and Audit Committee.
Mr. Smith, I think
Those
that
are
would-
appointments.
I think that with the
That's the
people that have expressed interest, we could probably just nominate them as a slate, considering that it looks like all the folks that are interested are here. And
Aren't those appointments?
Yeah.
These,
Are they?
That's the
by
chair.
policy, these are for the chair to appoint.
Okay, never mind, I apologize.
So,
Those appointments.
it's the chair.
Both the Finance and Audit Committee and the Legislative and Strategic Planning Committee are for the chair to appoint, as is the ad hoc committee. I don't believe you have any activity that needs to be taken by either of those committees, so you can leave that to your exercise your discretion as you're prepared to do so.
Yes, sir.
So I believe we have completed our process for the election of the Board of Officers and the various committees that are elections. Will I continue with the
Appointments
IOC?
of the, yes, sir.
Before we proceed with the Independent Oversight Committee, I think I need to give you a brief summary of what has happened recently. You all know, because I warned you at the last meeting, that litigation was pending. Litigation was filed. We, being the HART Board, have filed our answer affirmative defenses, and we have had various meetings with a variety of the attorneys. There is, not shockingly, a certain commonality of interest between the county, the cities, and HART. And we have been working together to try to preserve the transit surtax. We had a meeting, we've had a hearing, 2 hearings with the judge, and we had a meeting with opposing counsel. It was a very fruitful discussion with opposing counsel. I think we were able to help him understand our view of how Article 11 interacts with the statute. The statute is 212055. The argument essentially in the litigation is that Article 11 violates 212055, and 212055 is the action of the state, and the action of the state prevails in matters such as taxes. We believe there's not a conflict. We've argued such, and our argument is essentially, to burn it down to its core, is that it can't literally be in violation because there's a supremacy clause in Article 11, which says that we are subject to the requirements of the statute. And changes, and that was voted on by the citizens who approved the transit surtax. So if there are any tweaks or changes that need to be made to conform with the statute, they have been approved by those who voted for it. We don't believe where the discrepancy currently exists is in the scope of things that the other side believes need to be changed to make Article 11 more consistent with 212055. So we are having those conversations. I think we came a long way with Mr. Altenburn on Friday and explaining our views of what the IOC requires, for example. One of his issues was they have been given too much authority and too much power, and then done so in a manner inconsistent with 212055. We don't see it that way. We also think they can't exercise authority they don't have under 212055 because of the supremacy clause. That is, the statute prevails. I won't bog you down too much in the esoterica of the lawsuits, but I am reasonably optimistic at this time because the counsel for the opposing party indicated on Friday that he'd like to get together to talk about what the interlocal agreement might look like and whether we could agree on what that interlocal agreement would look like and therefore vitiate the need for continuing litigation. I don't know whether we can get there or not, but the discussions are being had. My presentation on Friday was essentially, if we understand the law the same in terms of the supremacy, all we need to do is really work on the language and come to a solution with the interlocal. One last thing, Hillsborough County Board of County Commissioners has scheduled for January 24th, pursuant to their last board meeting on December 5th, I think it was, a report from their staff to present to them a basis for which they can enter into an interlocal agreement that would implement the provisions of Article 11. One of the arguments on the other side is that the BOCC has been deprived of its authority. Our argument is no. In fact, they exercise their authority by entering into an interlocal agreement, carrying out the terms of Article 11. It's their charter, and it is certainly contemplated by 212.055 that interlocal agreements would be entered into in order to implement. So our position is we think the correct one, and we await anxiously the action by the Board of County Commissioners in order to develop an interlocal agreement that would be signed by all of the agencies. That would be, of course, the cities, HART, and the county in order to carry out the terms of Article 11. That having been said, there is still some discussion ongoing with what the IOC can do consistent with the statute. There's been various discussions about their veto authority. Let me give you a little bit of background. The way Article 11 is structured, the IOC is supposed to review any proffered plans submitted by HART, in the case of our proffered plans, the county, and the various municipalities. Those plans are reviewed for their consistency with Article 11. It's not a review in the abstract. It's not a policy-making board. They don't have the ability to come in and say, no, I think you should put it in these kinds of buses and not those kinds of buses. They have to evaluate the submittal by HART, for example, in terms of the requirements of Article 11 approved by the voters. It's not a blank slate. It's oversight. That's exactly what it means. So there's some people who've been concerned that they've been delegated too much authority. I think if you read Article 11 the way I think it's written, that's not the case. One other concern, though, is that there is the ability for the Oversight Committee to hold funds if any agency is proceeding in a manner inconsistent with Article 11. That may be or may not be consistent with 212.055. We're going to have to look at that issue. That's going to be a point of some discussion as we move forward. They can only withhold funds for failure to comply with the Article 11, however. So again, it's not their policy. It's oversight and making sure the policy is complied with. So that having been said, most entities such as HART are moving forward identifying and providing who is going to serve in their capacity on the IOC. This board has 2 spots. You have the summaries that were provided to you by those who indicated their interest and willingness to join. There has been, I don't want to bog you down again too much, particularly given our agenda, but there have been some questions regarding who can serve. 1110 under Article 11 has I think 2 sentences. It says no person then currently serving as an elected or appointed city, county, special district, state, or federal public office holder shall be eligible to serve as a member of the Independent Oversight Committee. First set of requirements. Additionally, no member of the Independent Oversight Committee may be employee of, independent contractor of, or otherwise be materially engaged for remuneration by any public or private recipient of surtax proceeds. That's a little anomalous at this point because we don't have any surtax proceeds. So there can't be anybody who could be a recipient of surtax proceeds. So initially, one of the applicants we thought serves on as an employee of Downtown Partnership. They could receive surtax proceeds. They don't at this point. If that should happen, and that would be for this board to determine, because you can use other sources of revenue to fund anything you may want to do with the Downtown Partnership, then that'd be a different issue. But right now, that person is not disqualified under the provisions indicated. We have one applicant who also serves on the Citizen Advisory Committee for the MPO. I do not know what the term public office holder means in this Article 11. It's generally, in local government, means someone with authority to make decision-making rather than serve in an advisory capacity. So our current view is not to disqualify that person from the ability to serve. I give you this background simply because I don't want you to be surprised if down the road we end up with interpretations from the AGO or someone else that causes us to have to revisit this issue. That having been said, are there any questions on the process? What I'd recommend we do, since you have multiple nominations, We don't literally have to have a vote today. You could each indicate your top 2 candidates, provide that to Ms. Pettit. She will tabulate those votes, and the highest 2 vote getters will be your nominations to serve on that committee. This is made up, spontaneously. We don't have a process. Article 11 does not have a process, but that seems to be, particularly given your agenda, the most efficient way to proceed.
Chair, could I ask a question? Sure. So just for procedural purposes, since we are currently in litigation, we have not started to receive funds. And of course, the IOC is to look at how we dispense funds. It's going to be a while before their job is going to be in place. So we do have a little bit of time on this.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that we're not going to be up against it later on over the next couple months. I would assume that we could probably make a decision next month based on the recommendations each one of us will make and give to Ms. Pettit, and then bring before as an agenda item afterwards. Now, one other procedural thing: if we are going to select a couple of folks, my suggestion would be that those that have gotten no votes or have not gotten enough votes would be eliminated to be part of the agenda next month. And that's the only thing, to make it quicker and kind of figure out where we're at. Because if we find out there's a consensus, we can go forward pretty quickly, as opposed to an election. I'm not sure if that's a procedural problem or not. But I know we do it on council all the time.
First of all, you're correct about the timing. The clerk is also a defendant in this lawsuit, and she informs us they probably will not have any money to distribute until sometime in March. So it's not precipitous, and probably not until the end of March. The process I had recommended was you just nominate, you put 2 people down on your list, we tabulate them, the top 2 are your candidates. Okay. I think you're indicating you want to come back with the top 4 and vote on it?
No. I just want to make sure that once we get our agenda item out, that we do have probably a top 2 at some point. I mean, we're not going to be able to communicate with each other after today's meeting, so that next month we might have 4, we might have 3. Just based on the numbers.
This would be the appropriate time if anyone wishes to speak on behalf of some nominee or potential nominee, and because after we're done, you're going to each decide who your top 2 are and provide it to Ms. Pettit without consultation, because you can't, other than in this venue. That's correct. Okay. So if anyone would like to make a recommendation for someone, feel free to do so.
Thank you.
I'd like to nominate Rick Fernandez. I think his experience being on the CAC makes him a wise choice in what our planning process looks like and understanding how transportation funding works. And I think that's a critical skill for this particular position. So if I need to do 2, I can do that. But I definitely want to make sure that I would voice my support for Rick Fernandez.
Anyone else?
I would just like to say I concur with that. I think he'd be a good person to be on that committee, and I'll be supporting him.
Any further comment?
Commissioner Smith?
Yes, and with everything that you've explained about the Independent Oversight Committee and the things we've all learned about it, I'm concerned to get people on this committee who will really understand the parameters and the scope of what this, what their business is, and make sure that we start right out of the gate with people who will not be inclined to overreach or try to expand the role or work on legislating in any way or making policy from that board, but just strictly interpreting the law and reviewing for consistency with our county's new charter amendment. And because of that, I agree that Rick Fernandez would be an excellent choice because he's got both. He's got the understanding of what this committee is supposed to do, as well as the background in transportation, and so I would be supporting him as well. And also, I think Sean Shaw, who has applied for this position, would be excellent in my view on those criteria, being an attorney who with a lot of experience in transportation issues within the community, but the understanding of the state law and the limited scope of this committee.
I'll second that.
Eric Shanahan.
I would just like for the members who weren't on the board when Mickey, I forget his last name.
Mickey Jacobs.
I was going to say Mickey Jacobs served with us. I would, highly recommend him as somebody who's both worked with the Downtown Partnership, is knowledgeable about the process here, and very knowledgeable about, the priorities in terms of the entire Hillsborough County. So I would, ask you to really do some serious consideration of his appointment and interest.
Director Melendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Talk to the mic.
Yeah, I would like to, actually, I didn't know I was going to echo Ms. Shanahan's comments, but I wanted to give a nod to two people, actually. And I think it is encouraging, or we should all definitely ring in on the folks that we know. The two names that I know are Mickey Jacob and Ray Shermonte. And Mickey I served with on this board. You can go back and look at check the tape, if you will, but he did an excellent job, and I think he would do an excellent job if he was appointed to this committee. As well as Ray Shermonte. I think that, in my experience out there in the public and in my interactions with Ray, what I've noticed is his integrity and his honoring the data is something that I think is a characteristic that he has that would be of great value to the committee, or to this Oversight Committee. So I would give that careful consideration. So with that, I think that what I would like to see is a makeup of someone with, like a Ray Shermonte or Mickey, with that agency experience, but then possibly the second person would be someone who's kind of a little bit of an outsider. Maybe that's not the right term, but someone that kind of brings more of a citizen perspective from the rider side as opposed to the agency side. Thank you.
Commissioner Kemp.
Thank you. I would really like to, and those were wise words, I think, that Commissioner Smith made about the role of this committee, since that's been such a controversy and a point. Obviously, we have a lawsuit over it. But, about the function of the committee, and we've heard so much. I look at it as an audit committee, not, strictly to look within the brackets here. I would just also concur that with both Mr. Fernandez and Mr. And Sean Shaw, for those reasons, and I'd like to say that we have really wonderful people that have made application to this, and I hope that we can use them all in capacities that are worthy. And I know that there's a lot of planning and transit experience within both the other candidates that were mentioned, and I hope that we start to get bigger roles within HART for those kinds of things. But I do look at this as not that where those kinds of depth on those kinds of issues would necessarily be it, because I look at it as more narrow, just, does it fall within the brackets type of thing. And so that's where I'm thinking about in terms of this, but I echo those concerns as I think we probably all do.
Director McLean.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to echo a little bit of the same sentiments that Director Melendez mentioned, but I'm going to harken back to a past board meeting. When the referendum was passed, I mentioned that this was a rare opportunity for us. We're in a very nice position now, where we'll be once everything's cleared up. And it was driven by the citizens of Hillsborough County. And so as we look at the candidates out there, and I agree, we have some very fine candidates out there. I would ask us all to think a little outside the box. We've been battling transportation for the last 20 years or so, and probably some would say more and some would say less. And some of the things that we've done in the past haven't worked. And so maybe bringing in some, what I would call fresh blood, would be a nice change to see. I agree that we need folks that are educated in transportation to some degree, and understand the community, if you will. But again, I would ask us all to think a little bit outside the box as we look at the candidates. This was a referendum pretty much driven by the citizens. I think having a citizen or two that is outside that transportation sphere, if you will, might be a nice addition and bring us a different perspective into transportation as we're looking at it today. So just my thoughts going forward.
Anyone else?
I guess I might have to say something here quickly. I guess two candidates on here stood out to me as well and are probably worth looking at when you look at the applications. One is a gentleman who works at HCC and I guess decided to sell his car and ride transit for 7 years. Dustin Lemke looks very interesting. And then additionally, Alana Brassier is a young woman that I first met when she approached me trying to learn how you could create a CRA, and was very interested in doing Main Street improvements along the corridor near where she lives. She's an employee of the Downtown Partnership. I again experienced her when she was volunteering with the effort to get the referendum passed as an active canvasser and knocking on doors. And I think that having a young woman that participated in that hands-on would send the right message to the people who really did the heavy lifting on this, and additionally bring something to the board that all the other candidates we've talked about here today don't have, all the youth and a different perspective. So anyway, and Rick Fernandez is I'm going to support him. So
Director Knight.
Yeah. Again, I appreciate the time that it's going to, for the next meeting. But what I like to do is I'm going to look at these different applicants, and I don't know a lot of them, but I'm going to listen to, I'm going to ask questions, and by the next meeting, I'm going to follow my heart on some recommendation from the community, and also with some of the ones who know more about, but I'm going to look at these applications. So you're saying Sean Shaw, that's the one that's got Shaw Shaw on the application?
Yes.
So I'm going to look through everything and make sure that I'm more educated on what's going on.
Anyone else? Mr. Sisler.
Yes, I do concur with looking outside the box in some of these things. But being a numbers guy myself, a lot of people on the campaign were talking about the Oversight Committee, and they said, well, there's got to be credibility to it. And having stood in the election line for 12 hours a day for 14 straight days of the early voting, that was the biggest complaint that I was hearing. Well, who's going to be minding the coffers? Who are we trusting to do this? And I firmly believe that one of the people has got to be a numbers person, or at least somebody from our representation. I know there was Stephen Pirelli. He was an individual, and then I kind of like the transportation mode with Elena Brazel. I think that's how she pronounced it. But outside the box means outside the box. Let's get a numbers person in there who understands the physics of what these taxes. It's coming out of our constituents' pockets, and it's 8.5%. We're now the highest sales tax. We need to get all the bang we can for all the bucks that we're spending.
Commissioner Overman.
I'll make one last comment. I actually had 4 people on my list, and unfortunately we only have 2. And that's a terrific thing that we've got such great applicants, and I hope that those that may not make this particular appointment, there are lots of other seats and lots, in this particular committee. It's not just us, but it's several other municipalities, and the board does have appointments as well. The good news is we've got great candidates, and I have 4 that I just absolutely adore, and 1 more I got added, so that makes it more difficult for us to choose. But doing a tally, I think, is important to make sure that we give everyone an opportunity and some direction on what we'd like to see happen.
Okay, this plane is coming for a landing now. All right, Mr. Smith, development of interview questions for candidates for HART.
I'm sorry, do I have any more?
Development of interview questions for the HART CEO.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. We're moving on.
Yes, we are.
Chair, you're enjoying being chair so much that you're delegating a lot today. Okay, I believe we have a presentation by Mr. Moser on that, don't we?
Well, it had your name for the development and interview question for candidates for HART CEO position.
Okay, well, I basically want to get questions from the board. What questions do you want to have the ad hoc committee go over in detail? I believe that's the process.
Okay.
You have a committee that's going to meet after this.
Right.
That committee will be taking the laboring oar. So this is your opportunity as an overall board to provide input that will go to the ad hoc committee. So any particular questions, concerns, items? I think you all received the resumes. You indicated the information about the people who are interested. So this is your opportunity to help us structure it.
Okay, we'll call on Mr. Seward.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me just overview the process that we're going to follow for the recruitment of the new CEO. The questions that you're going to provide today will be specifically used by the ad hoc for the interviews for the candidates that will come out of this afternoon's ad hoc committee for the 14th ad hoc review of those videos. Many of you have asked the question during one-on-ones or just during the holidays, are these three questions that we're going to provide the end-all questions that we can ask? The answer is no. The candidates that come out of the 14th that will be scheduled to come for the final interviews with this governing body in February, we will be bringing those candidates in to meet with each of you, those of you that want to meet with them, individually for you to physically ask them the questions and have conversations with each of them prior to them coming before the full governing body in February. So again, the questions today are specifically for the ad hoc meeting to provide to the candidates that are selected from this afternoon's meeting to develop a video for the 14th of January's ad hoc meeting to review. And again, you will have the opportunity to ask questions of the candidates prior to the February hiring meeting. So don't think that today is the only day or these three questions are the end all. They are not. You will have the opportunity to fully converse with each of these candidates. But I just wanted to make sure that the process was understood.
You keep saying the meeting this afternoon that follows this meeting, not this afternoon.
Yeah. That follows this meeting, that hopefully will not be this afternoon. Yes.
Ready, Shanahan, that's on your hand.
He explained it. I was just going to explain. The questions are going to, they then send in a video for these three questions. That's the initial screening down to the next level. So just so people understand the process.
Okay. I don't see anyone else at this particular point in time for any questions at this point. Commissioner Smith.
Thank you. I have questions that I'd like to suggest. Will they be taken down and then provided to the ad hoc committee?
Yes.
Set the plan?
Yes.
Am I allowed 3?
Sure.
Well, first of all, I would like to ask, I'd say Hillsborough is a very large county with a great diversity of communities from urban to suburban and rural, and with a wide range of cultures and income levels. And I would ask the applicants, what is your vision for HART to best serve this whole county effectively and equitably? We're kind of unusual in that regard in this metropolitan area, and I think that's it would be good to get that perspective from the candidates coming in.
It was effectively and equitably with
Equitably,
the two.
yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay, number 2. HART's next CEO will be taking the wheel, you'll forgive me this analogy, at the very moment that the citizens have voted to change direction and step on the gas. And they're pouring plenty of their own fuel into the gas tank now. So how will you change gears and steer us in this new direction at this very critical moment when things are changing so fast and changing to such a great degree?
Kind of paraphrased it a little bit, but I think I've gotten the concept. Essentially, given the changes that are occurring, particularly increase in revenue
Right.
would be significant. And also all the other changes that are going on. How do you intend to steer this organization in an effective manner in light of all the change in flux?
And the point is that we're not looking for somebody to just take over and steady as she goes with the same course we've been on. Everybody knows we're going to have to make a paradigm shift here in a big way and quickly.
The change presents an opportunity. How are you intending to utilize that?
Thank you.
Okay. Okay.
Well, I'll listen to some other questions first. But my third question would be, in light of the technological advances that are coming so quickly, like autonomous vehicles and other things we keep hearing about, but they're not here yet. So I would ask, what is the plan for guiding us in the short term with what we have and making progress as quickly as the citizens are expecting with this new referendum, and yet planning for the technological advances that will be coming down the pike, and how would this incoming CEO steer us in that way?
Okay.
Commissioner Smith, is that it?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Councilman Suarez, recognized.
Thank you. You know, Mr. Mechanic has had more time on this board, but I'm the longest continuous serving member, and I have served with 3 different CEOs, and they're all 3 very different people. You know, Jeff knows because he served with the 2 previous CEOs. And one of the things that I have looked at, you know, when we had Philip Hale, who took over for Armijo, Armijo had come in with the understanding that we were going to be a bigger agency, but we ended up not being a bigger agency because of the failure of the previous referendum before county voters. Philip Hale came in as someone that settled things down and actually tried to take control of what we had at the time and did a wonderful job of that. And then at the same time went ahead and mentored Catherine Egan, and I know that most of you, if not all of you, have had experience with Catherine. She was a tremendous CEO, and what I like to see, especially with this new position, this new person coming in on this position, is someone that is going to make a commitment to us for long term. So I'd like to ask that question as to whether or not they can make a commitment for 5 years at the very least for us. Secondly, some of the operational things that are incredibly important. We are no longer going to be a small agency. So we have to stop thinking about us as a small agency. And we need someone that is going to be able to control the growth in an appropriate way so that we can go forward and build a world-class agency. Right now, we're doing the best we can based on the amount of dollars we have. But now with the money that's going to be coming in through the offer transportation, we're going to find that this will be, if not the largest, one of the largest in Florida. And by looking at that, you need to make sure that as you grow as an agency, how are you going to be able to deal with employee morale, the kind of negotiations that you're going to have to do with the unions, how you're going to be able to reach out, and Commissioner Smith just mentioned about equity and being able to understand this incredibly diverse county. And I would like us to ask the question about coming up with a plan and how you're going to, I shouldn't say a plan, how will you look at a diverse county like Hillsborough County with the amounts of dollars that we're probably going to have? Because if we leverage our funds, we could have a huge amount of money, somewhere in the $2 billion or something more than that, based on the amount of money that we're going to be receiving on a yearly basis. So we need someone that understands the financial planning necessary for that, how we go ahead and grow the agency and to be as equitable as possible. Commissioner Smith mentioned quite a few of the things that I was going to mention anyway, but I would love to see someone who's young, hungry, ready to make this the premier agency in Florida or in the Southeast, if possible, because I think that we have that potential and we have that ability now. The hard part is finding the right person that's going to grow this agency and make it world class. Because without it, you know, this county, this city, the economic development that we're going to have to do over the next 20 years is going to fall by the wayside unless we have an incredible system. And I think that we have a great opportunity. So I hope you've got the paraphrasing. I won't ask you to repeat it back to me.
Okay.
I know you got it down well, but that is really what I'm looking for. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Hart, you recognize. Commissioner Kemp. Hart.
It's okay, Commissioner Hart. Thank you. I just make a little caution about not expressing, just in terms of youth, just because of legal issues about a profile of a candidate, as you know. But I would like to look at, have them speak to what experience they have in integrating and working within transit-oriented development, walkability, bicycles, and other means of connections. As we know, 80% of people walk to their transit. And so I think that is a huge part of transforming what we do. So I'd like to know what the experience and maybe what the vision is on that, but what experience they have in doing that and working with that, because I think that would be a huge area.
Okay. Anyone else? Commissioner, I'll go with you. Commissioner Oberlin.
Actually, I wanted to echo much of what Commissioner Smith had mentioned, and obviously you hit the nail on the head there. I think it's critically important that when we speak with the individuals that are going to be taking on this role, that they have excellent experience in an expanding multi-layer transit system. We have terrific planning being done. We have more plans than we have ever been able to implement sitting in the queue ready to go. But managing the growth of a transit system as it expands, as we anticipate, is going to be, having that skill is going to be critically important. And I don't want to go, I don't want to trust that someone that hasn't had that experience is suddenly going to have that experience. So I think it's critically important that we look at their background and what they've actually done in a growing comprehensive transit system. I haven't been able to go all the way through all the resumes yet to really ferret that out, but I think it's critically important that we have someone that has the vision. And if that means our scope of responsibilities needs to be reviewed or readdressed, I think it's worth considering, because that's really what we have to have. We have to have someone, in my opinion, that has that direct experience in managing the process of a widely expanding transit system using proven methods that have been successful in other municipalities as well as regions that we are. And I think that's critically important in our selection process.
Councilman Schuster.
Yes, thank you. I think that there's two issues that need to be brought forward. I agree we need to find somebody who, a lot of your issues, Commissioner Smith, the dynamics of how are we going to go forward and how are we going to manage everything. But I got two somewhat myopic questions, but I think that they're very important as we go forward. One is, what is their plan, what is their experience in leveraging some of the educational facilities like USF and the I think it's sort of Center for Urban Transportation facilities, Cutter. What what is your experience in working with these 8 organizations, and have you done so in the past, and what have you brought to the table with that? And the second one is more again of a numbers issue. I know we have very able financial officers and so forth, but we all have experienced financial turndowns. And my question would be, what would have been the largest fiscal issue you've ever addressed, either negative or positive, that has impacted your previous positions? How did you react? What was the outcome? I mean, we all had positions back in 2007, 2008, when everything went, went south on us, and everybody was dealing with huge revenue losses and revenue cutbacks due to property values. That hits again, we're back to the same position we were in. And whether it's with a governmental organization or a nonprofit, it affected everybody. And I think that that's important for us to understand their thought process and how that they potentially would react to it, either negative or a positive situation. Do we get spend happy? Do we get cut happy? What's going to be their demeanor in managing the physics of the operation? I think, to me, those are two very important questions.
Director Fernandez, you recognize.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have two questions. One, actually, Councilman Schisler, you kind of addressed, so I'll be brief on it. But the first one is, in your history, in either leading or supporting, giving us a budget, whatever that budget is, this is your moment to brag. How did it go? What were the metrics? And provide actual, data points. And if it didn't go well, talk about, why didn't it go well? What were the challenges? What did you do to try to mitigate that? Second question is, with such a large influx of money and the pressure that comes with that, just in general, but also from, external, just across the board, how do you plan to be effective and keep the humanity side in mind? Meaning, we're all going to be looking, at the numbers and plans and big plans, and people are going to have ideas. But I'm interested in how is the CEO going to address the fact that we cannot lose the humanity side of things as they move forward, and I'd like them to specifically address that, whether they use examples from the past or some ideas they have. Thank you.
Anyone else? Anyone else? You have all that, Mr. Smith?
I believe I do. We'll have further discussion, I'm sure.
Okay, all right. Okay, we're going to move on to approval of action items. Resolution number R 2019-01-01.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Resolution 2019-0101, authorizing the interim chief executive officer to award a contract to Transit Unit Digital Security Systems for $1.5 million. This will allow us to put security cameras not only on our fixed route vehicles, but our paratransit vehicles and our streetcars. We have been working on this for a number of years. It's been a safety deficiency. This gives us the opportunity to move forward. The reason that it did not go to a committee is we did not have a committee scheduled in December.
Move approval.
Second. Motion by Director Shanahan, second by Councilman Suarez. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor, let them know by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed likewise, motion is adopted. Resolution 2019-01-02.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As you heard Mr. Smith talk earlier concerning the litigation for the sales tax, this is above and beyond the Gray Robinson scope of services. We need to amend the Gray Robinson contract to accommodate the ability for Mr. Smith to continue in that capacity for HART during this litigation process. There is a note, though, I want to make and make it very clear that these are tax dollars that we are spending. They are coming out of fund balance. This was not a projected expenditure for this year. It will come back in a budget amendment later once we start the actual flow of the revenue in which the litigation is slowing. But again, I wanted to make a point that this is taxpayer money that we are spending, and we are one agency out of multiple agencies having to work within this litigation. So with that, this is an increase of $75,000. This gets us through, I believe, an estimate of March. If it goes past March for any reason, we will have to come back to the board and amend again. It's $75,000 that you're approving today for the increase in the contract. However, in the month of December, the chair and I already conducted a deviation to pay for December services in the amount of $38,000, which has already been paid. It's not part of this contract amendment, but now we're already looking at, through March, probably over $110,000 that we're having to spend for this litigation. I just wanted to make that comment.
Are there any questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Well, motion by Director Shanahan, second by Director Williams. Mr. McKinney.
Speaking in favor of the motion, I just wanted to say a couple things. One is understanding the magnitude of this litigation and the complexity. This is I think, a very reasonable request. Number two, I have reviewed all of the documents filed in this litigation and spoken with Mr. Smith at length, and I want to say that he and his firm are doing an exemplary job, and I think we need to support this motion. Thank you.
Anyone else? He also takes good notes, too. Anyone else?
I'd like to echo David's mechanic's comments, because seeing how rapidly you've been able to adjust and interpret and defend the lawsuit and our agency has been quite impressive, and I want to thank you for it. Thank you. Seems like a good deal to me.
Anyone else?
I'm on board as well. I like the work they've done.
Seeing no further discussion, all those in favor of the motion, let me know by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, likewise. Motion is adopted. Presentation, strategic transit planning. Yes, Mr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, as we have started to discuss the use of the sales tax, irrespective of the litigation, I would argue that in the 40-year history of HART, there has not been a more important time in this organization's history as we face right now. This additional referendum, the impact that this organization can have in our community, there is no more important time in HART's 40 years as right now. So with that thought, knowing that we are ready to take not only this organization but the community completely into a different direction for transit, I thought it would be a very good time to have someone come speak to you that has experience in agencies across not only the country but the world of changing and smashing that paradigm as agencies grow and expand. I had the opportunity in multiple APTA events over the last few months to ask my peers across the country, explaining what we're getting ready to do, and the same name came up over and over again, as well as many of our board members who have brought this name forward as well. So with that, I was able to arrange to have Mr. Jarrett Walker come this morning, talk to you at a high level on exactly what next steps on this evolutionary track this board will need to take in the coming months and coming years. So with that, Mr. Walker, thank you for making the trip from probably a very wet Portland.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And great to have the opportunity to speak with you today. Is the presentation going up? Great. Really appreciate the invitation to come in and talk with you this morning. I have been a consultant in public transit and planning and policy for about 25 years now, working with a lot of different transit agencies, and I wrote a book about it called Human Transit. Hang on, I don't appear to have control of this. Now I do, all right. Do I? There we go, all right. Wrote a book called Human Transit about this, which is a pretty friendly explanation of just what public transit is, how it works. It's really motivated by the fact that public transit, there's some facts about public transit that just seem intuitively wrong until you really focus on them and understand them. And so a little bit of work needs to be done to bring citizens together in the presence of the reality about what public transit is, what it can realistically do or not do, and what kinds of questions we have to think about it. So I'm just going to give you the highest level overview in the 20 minutes I have, with the understanding that there's a lot more, of course, we could talk about. So the case for public transit, there are many cases, but the most compelling and the most unavoidable is the case about space. The amount of space that, say, 100 people take if they're in private cars, as opposed to if they're in a bus, as opposed to if they're on bicycles. This famous image is of a fairly dense urban street because it's in that urban higher density setting, which is not what all of your community is, but which is what more of the community wants to be. It is in that kind of setting that you inevitably run out of space for everyone to drive cars. One of the things I want you to notice about my comments today and in general is that I'm going to be mostly describing geometric facts. If you stop and think about them, it's completely obvious that it has to be this way. And if you're aware that you're in the presence of geometric knowledge, it's really helpful to notice that, because then you stop needing data. And you stop needing, and you understand that you know this really certainly. There's really no other data we need to understand that people take less space if they're moving down a street in a bus than if they're moving down a street in private cars that take so much more space per person. Most of what I'm going to say in this presentation is geometric. It's stuff we know the way we know the value of pi. So I want to encourage us all to feel a confidence in that as we work through it. So we're in an area of exciting technological innovation. Lots of new products are being pitched to us. So let's start with the fact that technology never changes geometry, that none of the ideas that are out there are going to change the basic facts of how physical space works and what it means to use physical space efficiently. That's how much space people take if they're on a bus. That's how much space they take if they're in private cars. That's how much space they take if they're in taxis or Uber or Lyft. Then once we have driverless cars, it looks more like this, right? And at this point, the driverless car people will come at me at this point and say, but the cars will be closer together because they won't need as much stopping distance. That's true, but there's a much larger issue that kicks in at that point called induced demand. Induced demand is the blatantly obvious biological principle, which is that if something becomes easier, people will do it more. Any organism will tend to do things the easiest possible way. And so if driving becomes dramatically easier because we eliminate the hassle of driving itself, then it's going to trigger a huge explosion of vehicle trips, thus a huge explosion in congestion. I think most people understand that now. So there's going to be need to be a way of mitigating that if that technology comes on, which is why I think we'll ultimately get to the driverless bus. Notice, though, that no matter what the technology is, we will never have room in a reasonably dense city for everyone to drive cars. It's a purely spatial geometric problem. It has nothing to do with culture. But we will always have room for more spatially efficient forms of transportation, whether it's cycling and scooters like in the middle image, or whether it's public transit that's designed for high ridership. The other thing to notice is that that's a fact about space that's always going to be true. But in addition, prior to automation, we have the question of the efficient use of labor. Your staff will be able to give you your own numbers, but generally speaking in the transit industry, operating cost is about 70% labor. Operating cost is about 70% labor. Please be prepared to say this to your constituents when they say, wouldn't smaller buses be cheaper to operate?
Yes.
No, smaller drivers are cheaper to operate, which is to say, the way we save money on operations is to pay the driver less, and you should expect at some point to get what you pay for there. So that much of the fantasy of miniaturization that's out there, and you can make other arguments for miniaturization, but much of the idea of micro or small transit is this notion that it must somehow be more efficient because big buses have all these empty seats. But in fact, the marginal cost of empty seats on a big bus is trivial. In fact, the logical thing for a transit agency to do is to run the largest bus that it will need at any time during the day. And because the fact that seats are empty really has no cost at all. The cost is in the driver. Now, people are coming at us with a lot of different goals about transit. And one of the things I tend to find and I tend to work on is to look for the things that people who think they disagree actually agree on. And one of the things that I have found as I've listened to lots of people talk about transit from a lot of different perspectives is that they're still often talking about freedom. So let's talk about freedom for a minute. Think about the respect in which we are all to varying degrees in prison, where the walls of our prison are the limits of where we could get to in a reasonable amount of time. Beyond that wall are places you can't go, jobs you can't hold, schools you can't go to, houses of worship you can't attend, clubs you can't belong to, people you cannot meet on a daily basis. So what if we wanted to move those walls outward so that people had more choices in their lives? Well, what does it mean to have meaningful choices in your life? That's what freedom is, right? Freedom is that basic sensation that there are choices before you and different things you could do. You don't just have to go to the one grocery store that you can get to. You have choices. So this is an image from Dublin, Ireland, where we're doing a network redesign now. And I want you to visualize someone asking the question, where could I go in 45 minutes? And understand that that is basically the same as the question, what jobs could I hold? What school could I go to? What's within that wall? And I can show someone, I'm sorry, I can show someone what that looks like right now. And then under a network proposal, like the proposed redesign of the buses we're working on in Dublin now, what that would look like. And I can show them what the difference is. And I can say, okay, Jane in this location can get to 43% more jobs, which probably means she can also get to 43% more retail, 43% more grocery stores, 43% more of all kinds of things that make her on some fundamental level 43% freer. She has 43% more choices in her life. Now this turns out to be something that a lot of different people who think they disagree are actually all interested in. Because this is quality of life. This is prosperity. The whole point of a city is for people to be able to get to each other so they can do things together. This is also sustainability to the extent that we make this possible by a means that fits in the city and works with the environment as public transit does. And this is also justice to the extent that when we're talking about excluded or marginal populations, we're talking fundamentally about giving them opportunity. Freedom and opportunity are almost the same thing. So we're talking here about all the physical dimensions of freedom, all the dimensions, every kind of freedom that we value as Americans that involves stepping outside the front door. Not the stuff we do on the internet, but everything else. You have to be able to get there. And it matters how long it takes to get there. And that ultimately determines the limits of what you can do. So transportation planning is freedom planning. You here are in the freedom business. And I think that's something we need to embrace. It's an awesome responsibility to decide what kind of freedom people will have. That's ultimately what all transport planning is. But the interesting thing about freedom is that it's entirely a geometric fact. Where you can get to is something we can describe geometrically. So what's the ridership recipe? Well, the ridership recipe, by and large, is the freedom recipe. Give people access to more places, make service useful for more people, and in more situations, and more people ride. That's what we see everywhere. How do we do that? Well, the way you actually expand that blob mathematically most effectively is to run patterns of high-frequency service tending to focus on places that are dense, walkable, and linear. Density means that there are lots of people around every stop. Walkability means that the people around that stop can actually get to the stop. And linearity means that the bus can drive or train can drive a logical path that feels like a straight line instead of having to meander to go into parking lots, go into cul-de-sacs, and so on. So that's how you bring the most useful destinations within reasonable travel time of the most people, and that's what ridership increasing service plans tend to do. I just want you to notice again, the path from the network to the freedom outcome is a purely geometric calculation. The path from freedom to a ridership prediction is social science. That gets a lot of other things in there, psychology and markets and so on. But freedom is still the foundation of ridership. If we're not, and another way to think about it is that a freedom outcome is also a long-term investment. Ridership will go up and down for other reasons. It's naturally volatile. Right now it's down in most agencies, although it's not falling out of its recent historic range. It's not a crisis. We're down, but it's also naturally volatile. It's going to go up and down. But the actual freedom outcome, the where you can go, that's something quite permanent and something whose value is quite lasting. So I want to talk a bit about frequency, because in my experience, for people who don't use transit regularly themselves, frequency is the thing that they are most likely to undervalue. And I think that's because in a motorist's experience, there's nothing really like it. The closest you get as a motorist to that experience of not being able to go until something happens is probably the cycling of traffic signals. But in transit, of course, you can't go until the vehicle comes, and that's the fundamental barrier. So how do we make that barrier smaller? Well, that's what frequency is, service coming more often. Frequency is expensive, and we have lots of competing demands. So it's important to understand why it pays off so well. It's a cubed benefit. It does three independent good things in a way that's mathematically independent from each other. Frequency means you go when you want to go. It means you make connections easily to get more places. It's really frequency that combines routes into a network where you can go lots of places instead of just the route you're on. And it also means less risk of being stranded by disruption. Because those things are interdependent, you get a nonlinear payoff to frequency that we see everywhere. Every time my firm does a transit plan, anywhere we take a dot for every route and we throw it into a database. Higher frequency is to the left. Higher productivity, ridership per cost of service, over cost of service is going up. And as you see, higher frequency, even though it increases service cost, even though it pulls that productivity ratio down in terms of costing more, still correlates with higher productivity. So that really suggests that nonlinear payoff to the frequency investment, particularly when we get up to that frequency of about every 15 minutes or better all day. Shorter trips, by the way, need higher frequency. Your streetcar, for example, specialized around extremely short trips, has to be extremely frequent or there's no point. Over longer distances, the generally sort of 3 miles or longer distance, that's the bulk of what transit agency does, 15-minute frequency is very acceptable. One of the things to notice that's happening, by the way, is that as we are seeing more personal vehicle options like the bicycle, the scooter, the things that fit in the bike lane that go 15 miles an hour or so for most people, those are going to take more and more market share for trips up to about 2 or 3 miles. And there's a possible future in which transit is therefore allowed to specialize more on the longer trip, longer than that, which could suggest wider stop spacing, a little more emphasis on speed rather than immediate access close to things, perhaps more limited stop service. It's the thing to think about, that sense that it may be good for transit to shift, for more of the 1-2 mile trips to shift over to the active modes, and for transit to be able to specialize on the trips that are really too long for most people to cycle. Frequent bus service has a really important nexus with affordability, which is that unlike rail service, it can't possibly drive up housing prices anywhere. So as you think about redevelopment, of course, the redevelopment, also the flip side of it is problems of affordability. In a very dense and built-out city where I live, Portland, Oregon, we have horrific affordability problems. And our urgent investment in frequent bus service is very tied to the fact that we need to get useful freedom out there to a lot of places without driving up land prices everywhere to the point that nobody can afford to live there. And that's why, having built an extensive rail system, we're now really obsessed with frequent buses in Portland. I want to emphasize that frequent bus services themselves tend toward permanence to a degree that supports redevelopment. You will hear that you have to have rails in the street in order to have permanence. I disagree. I think there's a confusion underlying that. But what I can show you in Portland are lots of streets that are now lined with 4-story buildings that are based entirely on frequent bus service. That's the only service on that street. But it's good. However, you have to draw and promote the high-frequency network very clearly. Lots of transit agencies are doing this. They draw a map of just their high-frequency services. Here's the network for people in a hurry. Here's the network for people who don't wait. And by the way, real estate industry, if somebody comes to you and wants to rely less on cars, wants to have a place with good transit, put them on that network. Don't just put them on any bus route. Put them on that network. It's the most permanent network. And permanence of frequent buses, it's very important to think about what that is. The permanence of a frequent bus service lies in the fact that a frequent bus service is a high ridership service, and a high ridership service is unlikely to be cut, right? So while you will sometimes hear, well, bus service could always change, yes, but a frequent bus service is not likely to change because it's succeeding. That's what it's designed to do. You have to remember, too, when you think about permanence, transit operating cost is mostly labor, and operating cost ultimately swamps capital cost. A common mistake made in thinking about transit is for people who come from the capital side, from the building side, architecture, or roads or whatever, is assuming that transit is something we build. And yes, transit may be something we build, but ultimately it has to be something we operate, and operating costs will always swamp capital cost in the long term. So that's why, for example, when I see streetcars, great, wonderful experience, but the rail, and a lot of people say, well, the rails give it permanence. No, you have to win a battle for the operating budget year after year after year after year. And if the operating budget isn't there, rails in the street won't save it. After all, we had lots of streetcars, and they turned out not to be permanent because they couldn't justify their operating budget. So frequent buses can be permanent because, to the extent that they succeed, because high ridership is permanence. And the high ridership, in turn, lies in the permanence of the land use pattern, the permanence of the built environment. Once we have built a city like that, the service is permanent because the demand is permanent. It's there in the land use pattern. Now, I've given you a quick handout, which you should have. It looks like this. And this is something that you can take with you and put on your wall and think about later as a memento of this quick conversation. But what I've done here is to take a series of key choices. These are different debates that you will have, and as you have them, it will appear that you're having separate conversations about each thing. And I want you to be aware that all of those conversations are really about the same thing. Because in each of those conversations, you have the opportunity to move toward or away from a more liberating network, a network that gets more people to more places sooner. So just quickly, I'm taking a spin around this diagram. You'll have people who will come to you and say, I don't change buses, or you can't expect me to change buses, or how dare you ask me to change buses. And if you're not willing to change buses, then what that's going to require is a network where there's a direct bus from everywhere to everywhere else, which means you'll have 500 bus routes, which means you can only afford to run any of them once an hour, right? The way we build up frequency is by requiring people to change buses, and frequency makes it easy to change buses. How far will people walk? Now, this is a tricky one because our senior and disabled populations tend to have a very different view from everyone else. And that's something that it will be your job to negotiate. It's not easy. The answer isn't obvious. For most people, though, most people are willing to walk further to better service. Not only a matter of being willing psychologically, it's actually the logical thing to do in order to get to as many places as possible. If you just calculate how people would logically make a trip to get to as many places as possible, as soon as possible, it often makes sense to walk further to better service. That could mean a line that's a little further away, or it could mean stops on a line that are a little further apart. Peak or all day. Many of your constituents will come to you focused entirely on rush hour. They'll think, okay, transit's about fighting congestion. Congestion's mostly at rush hour, so transit must be about rush hour. The way we build the most effective transit systems, though, is not to start with the rush hour problem, but to start with building an all-day, all-the-time network that then we add to on rush hour. So here's a typical way of thinking about it. Every transit agency has a typical peaking pattern where ridership goes up in the morning, down a little in the middle of the day, goes up in the afternoon. The question is how you conceptualize that. And the way a lot of agencies will start is, well, there's the peak, which is the important thing. And then in between, there's this less important thing, we might call it the off-peak. And I suggest you turn that around and say, no, there's an all-day network, which is the important thing. And then on top of that, you add peak services as needed to meet the peak's needs. Very important conceptual shift that tends to lead you toward a better all-day service that makes it easier for people to rely on transit needs all the time. Notice a little bit of a justice dimension here in that more fortunate people, wealthier people, are more likely to be rush hour commuters. When I'm in a room full of bureaucrats, it's easy to get them talking about the peak because they're all peak commuters. You got to remember, everybody who works at Walmart, everybody who works at Burger King, everybody who works low-wage jobs, they are not peak commuters. They come and go all over the clock. And they are really the foundation of robust all-day ridership, which is also much less, all-day service is so much less expensive for you to provide. Pulling out a bus just for the peak period is extremely expensive because you have to pay a driver to work just for 2 hours, you have to own a vehicle that you don't use very much, and so on. Protect transit from congestion. This is fairly obvious. We'll get better outcomes if we do. Diversity or specialization. This is really inside a lot of other things I've talked about. Many people will come to you with their own group's needs. And it will be easy to imagine, well, we need a bus for this group of people. And if you go very far with that, you end up with 3 buses going down the same street specialized around 3 different groups of people: the seniors bus, the students bus, the tourist bus, and so on. But transit starts to succeed when we get all those people on the same bus. That's how we build up frequency. And so the real success of transit is if people who are strangers, people who are demographically different, people with different trip purposes are all finding the same service useful. So that's why I say specialization is, broadly speaking, a danger. It tends to lead us away from creating the most abundant access that's useful to anyone. And finally, your thought about you're going to have lots of debates about technology. People get excited about building things. People get excited about technology. People get excited about rail and ferries and various kinds of technologies, and it's great that people get excited. But ultimately, you're going to have the question of, are we selecting technologies out of excitement? Are we selecting technologies, for example, out of beliefs of how the market reacts to them? Or are we selecting technologies because they help us create the most liberating possible system for the most possible people? And that's really a question to bring to any technology debate. Because, of course, the marketers of the technologies want you to buy their technology. It's your work as customers of those marketers to be thinking about what you're actually going to get and what purpose the technology is actually serving. And there are ways to choose technology that make it easier to get to more places, and there are also ways to choose technology that actually impede that actually get in the way of that. Finally, briefly, the ridership coverage trade-off is probably the single hardest choice that you'll face as you talk about individual issues. And this goes to the fundamental fact that most transit agencies are frankly being framed. They're being given contradictory demands and being asked to pursue those demands with the same dollar. You look in the media at how often transit ridership is being treated as the evidence of transit success, and falling ridership as evidence of failure, which assumes, of course, that ridership is even what you are trying to do. But I've never worked for a transit agency that is unequivocally trying to maximize ridership. They're always trying to do something else. So if your goal were to maximize ridership, what you would do is take all of your service and put it in the densest parts of your region and run the highest possible frequency there. Remember that frequency is a cubed value. Its payoff is nonlinear, so you would want to ride that curve by running really high frequency, but only in the places that are most favorable with no service anywhere else. That's what thinking like a business would mean. That's what it means to support dense and walkable development and all the environmental benefits of transit, competing with cars, vehicle miles, travel reduction. That's how you would do it. But a big chunk of the population would not have any service. So there's this competing goal that people bring. Think like a public service, access for all. Who can be against that? Supporting low density building, lifeline access for everyone. This is very important. There are people with needs everywhere. And finally, of course, political geography, service to every member city or electoral district. Those are all reasons that we run coverage services. In a coverage scenario, you run a little bit of service everywhere. Because you have lots and lots of routes, you can't afford to run any of them very often, so the frequency is very low, so not very many people find it useful, so ridership is low. So I can't protect you from the ridership coverage trade-off. In fact, my job is not to make it easy, my job is to make it clear. And one of the basic things I do is take communities through this conversation, run public conversations about this question, and help people think about what they actually want from their transit agency, which helps them form more realistic expectations about what you should be measuring and what actually matters counts as success. For example, I take transit agencies through a process of thinking about where they want to be on this spectrum. I ask them to think about how they would divide their resources between a ridership goal and a coverage goal. Because if you can do that, then staff knows what to do. Staff knows how to deliver that, knows how to say, okay, here are the ridership services, judge them on ridership. Here are the coverage services, don't judge them on ridership. That's not their purpose. In Houston, for example, when we did this process, I came in, their existing network was 55-45. We took them through a process of thinking about alternatives. I was very clear, if you turn the dial toward ridership without new resources, they didn't have new resources, then you're cutting coverage service. And that means people are going to scream at you. You'll get more ridership and more screaming. The board chose 80-20. We designed the plan to that goal. You've probably heard a lot about the Houston plan. It's the only network in Texas where ridership is increasing, one of the few networks in the country. And that's because they went through a very difficult process of figuring out what their priorities were and designing to those priorities. So just to wrap up, everything I have to share with you, certainly everything that's on this diagram, is a geometric fact. It comes with thinking geometrically about what transit is, what frequency is, and how that interacts with a land use pattern to generate freedom. That's all stuff we can describe mathematically. You don't actually need data to understand that, although there is lots of data showing that a high-frequency network tends to be a high ridership network. So with that, I want to thank you very much for your time. Happy to take a few questions up to the limits of your time.
Any questions? Commissioner Kemp, I see your hand.
Thank you. I'm very, and thank you to Mr. Seward for bringing Mr. Walker in today. I'm very happy. I've read and watched, read your studies, read of you on all the blogs. I know you've really, I think, transformed the whole bus transit redesign concept in a way that no one has ever defined it before. And I just, because I think the board may not be as familiar, I know that you have redesigned the Houston system, and as you said, no more resources, but you also worked in Portland for years, did redesign in Portland and Seattle, I think Toronto.
We've worked in several places that are in your situation of planning for new resources. Indianapolis and Raleigh are two of the most recent. We're involved in a lot of the referenda that have gone to voters. But yes, the redesign of Houston, the redesign of Auckland, New Zealand is one of the ones I'm more proud of, and so on.
And when I read about the redesign of Raleigh, and you've now been consulting to New York, and I just, what you've done is really transformative. One of the things I just wanted to point out, because you didn't say it, is that what has happened, Seattle put a lot of new resources in when you did that redesign. As I understand, they now have 50% of people commuting into the downtown using transit every day, with 60,000 new jobs added just recently.
Yeah, if you're Seattle, if you're taking that kind of growth in your downtown, there really is no alternative to increasing transit ridership. There's no room for everyone to drive. And so yeah, I worked on I didn't redesign it, but I worked on the original Seattle transit plan, which was, it's a very important thing for those of you who represent a municipality. The city of Seattle decided that even though there was a regional transit agency that ran its transit, they needed municipal transit policy because they needed to have policy that governed their decisions about, for example, how to accommodate transit in the street space, when to remove parking so that you could have transit facilities or whatever. They needed their own municipal policy to guide that. So an important thing about the Seattle story is, hello, city of Tampa, you have a role. You have a role in if you control streets and if you control land use, then you control transit as much as the transit agency does. And you always have to be confident in saying that to your municipal partners. And the Seattle story is really about the city taking the lead.
My other thing is, I think Raleigh, in North Carolina, Walker County, I believe you did.
Wake County.
Wake County, that's right, Wake County. And Walker. But I think that is a very parallel situation to Hillsborough County in size, populations, Raleigh City. Then there's Raleigh and Durham, which is without a body of water in between. But I mean, there's all those kinds of considerations. And I guess one thing I'd just like you to talk about for a minute is what you do in terms of public engagement when you do this, because I know this community is chomping at the bit to be part and to understand and to move forward with a vision for what we should be doing here. So how do you work?
One of the things we really specialize in when we do this process is I take the community through a process of thinking about outcomes before they start talking about projects. So, there are things you can do that will, do that will, trigger short-term economic development. There are things you can do that trigger, that generate more in the way of justice outcomes. There are also things you can do that do a little bit of all of those things, which is, I think, why I'm interested in abundant access. But there's also, for example, the ridership coverage trade-off, which is really a question of, do we focus transit where the most people will use it and where it generates the most freedom for the most people? Recognize that when we say most people, we mean not everyone. Or do we try to have a little bit of service everywhere so that we've touched everyone? That's the ridership coverage trade-off. We do a lot of surveys. We're running them right now, one of these right now for UTA in Salt Lake, where we take the public through that question. We want the public's view of that question. And obviously we're listening as we do, because we're ultimately leading to a board decision about how to balance ridership coverage goals, how much to spend on each of them. But also, of course, the public is also it is helping the public form more realistic expectations. It's helping journalists form clear expectations, so that the next time they hear about a ridership number, they understand that ridership isn't the sole measure of a transit agency's success, if it's chosen to also do other things.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I've read a lot of your work for a long time, so I'm really glad you're here. Earlier today, you heard that we are in the process of interviewing for a CEO. I'd love to get your observations as to what the most critical skills are for an individual that is leading an agency in where we are, where we suddenly now have resources, we now have lots of ideas, and we have lots of competing shiny toys that people are interested in. And so what would you see as being maybe the top 3 skill sets of a successful CEO in this space?
Well, I think there are a number of basic skills in a manager, particularly a manager of an organization that has a large workforce, which I think you can assess. It's one of the reasons that there is an expertise in transit management. It's just what's involved in workforce management and working with that kind of workforce, which are important skills. I think in terms of interacting with the community, though, the ability to think at high altitude and to ask the public the right questions is really crucial. I think correspondingly to me that a strong opinion about any particular transit technology is not something I would be attracted to in looking for a CEO. There will be no shortage of opinions. Lots of people will bring opinions about technologies. What you really need is the credibility as an agency, as your credibility in terms of your ability to think across all those different things and to think more fundamentally about what you're ultimately trying to do. So I would think the ability to think in terms of metrics and in terms of outcomes and not to be emotionally attached to any technology, including buses, is a really important thing we need now in an industry, particularly, as was said earlier, if you see yourselves as being a mobility provider rather than being invested in, rather than a bus agency or a streetcar agency or a rail agency or any of those sort of modal visions that we inevitably come to. It's going to be this agency's job to think across modes, to think across technologies, and to get back to what people ultimately need, why people are ultimately funding you, right? It doesn't hurt to ask, why do you exist? What do the taxpayers expect when they fund you? And that requires, that requires the ability to engage the public at that sort of level. And so when I deal with friends coming from the engineering profession who are where they are because they've built stuff, many of them are great leaders, but that's because they've been able to get beyond just building stuff to actually having the conversation with the community about what it's ultimately about.
Thank you.
Councilman Suarez, you're recognized.
Thank you, appreciate it. Thanks for the presentation, I appreciate it. And one of the things that I love about your presentation is the last part of it is, and is the most important part of it. That idea of coverage or ridership, it really goes down to value. What do we value as a community? What do we value as a bus system? And one of the things that I wanted to ask you was specifically about when you're looking at that push and pull, okay? A lot of times, and having been doing this for a while now, people start looking at guys in ties. That's what they're trying to attract, as opposed to looking at what we're actually trying to do for everyone, as opposed to just to chase the next shiny object, the next technology. You know, this will change the way that people ride, or this is what's really going to make people get on a particular vehicle. And I'm glad that you've determined that's not it. It really is about the frequency. It really is about what we value as an agency. With the Houston example, considering what we have in terms of some federal issues concerning equity, how did you deal with that push and pull with, you know, I assume that Houston gets a significant amount of federal dollars, just like a lot of other agencies across the country. How did you deal with that particular issue?
Title VI, the actual civil rights law around this,
Right.
was very frustrating to deal with in Houston, and I'll tell you why. It's because Houston's own Title VI policies were, I think, largely inconsistent with the actual goal of Title VI
Right.
and the actual spirit of Title VI, because their policies were all about peak service. And low-income people don't need peak service. They need all-day service. There was a fundamental disconnect there. So I think it starts with thinking through what you're going to define. You have a lot of latitude to define Title VI policy and to make sure you're defining policy that's actually relevant to the experience of lower-income people and people of color and so on. Mm-hmm. And that requires listening to them and hearing about them. But for example, one of the things that's increasingly coming up as a win-win, both for ridership and also from a civil rights perspective, is evening and weekend service investment. One of the biggest things that we did in Houston was to turn up the weekend service level all the way up. It's actually, the weekend schedule is the same as the weekday schedule minus the peak. Mm-hmm. And we got an enormous weekend ridership growth, but also that was a very important civil rights action because, again, the lower income person, you know, the communities of concern, they're not peak commuter. I want to emphasize one other caution here. You can look up an article of mine if you Google the term elite projection. And it can sound like I'm calling someone an elitist, which I'm not. It's a caution that people in relatively fortunate positions are in danger of assuming that they are the design customer. And that you'll hear people talk about their own personal tastes as though that's a good guide to what makes a good network. And obviously, if you're much, much wealthier than average, you're unusual, and that means you're not a good guy. You know, Walmart did not create its incredibly successful product through executives thinking about their own personal tastes. You know, and it's really important when you think about transit. It's really important kind of mental adjustment. Everything. It's pretty important with the technology industry because in the technology industry, they're so used to the idea of the early adopter, you know, that in many cases, well, with cars, for example, you expect that wealthy people will be the early adopters and eventually they'll scale to everyone. But transit doesn't work like that because you need scale right away. And the way you get scale is by thinking about everyone and by thinking about how everyone gets around. It's ultimately what works for traffic congestion too, right? If you want fewer cars on the road, let's help low-income people not own cars. And the way you do that is to make a transit system that's broadly relevant.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Anyone else? Ladies and gentlemen, we got a lot to do. Mr. Megatti can recognize.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I'm interested in your reaction to the, I guess, a question. We have a transit development plan, an adopted transit development plan that contains a lot of projects that previously we had no real way of affording. And when I look at that, and I know that our executive director, our CEO, has said, you know, that's a guide to what we are now looking at for the future, knowing that we have this, significant influx of funding. But the question that comes to my mind, and I guess I'd like you to comment on it, is when you have so little to work with as we had, that transit development plan has no real aspirations, or at least it has aspirations which are so much less than we are potentially capable of. How do we transition between using that as a guide and looking at other things as we move forward?
That's an excellent question because you're right. A poverty-driven plan is going to have low ambitions. And I think the important thing here at this point, especially when you're under the barrage of all kinds of technology salespeople coming through, who will be pitching you on various monorails or whatever that is. There's always something. It's all the more urgent that you have a conversation about outcomes before you have a conversation about projects. And it is important to have conversations about projects, but even so, as you've got all these ideas, for example, about, the Florida BRT and Nebraska BRT, or doing something with the CX line, back up and say, let's have a conversation about downtown to the university, and let's have a conversation about all the options for doing that, and all the different kinds of possibilities and the pros and cons of those. Let's make sure we have a clear understanding of the whole point of what we're trying to do and how we'll measure success. I would suggest, that freedom, because it's something that's inside of justice and prosperity and sustainability, is a good thing to look at. That's my idea of a good metric, but you're going to have others. And then come back to projects. And as much as possible, take the public through that thought process. So help the public be less attached to projects and more interested in outcomes by virtue of being involved in the conversation about outcomes. And then you'll get to good projects.
Commissioner Smith, recognized.
Thank you. I would just like to also thank Mr. Seward for bringing this this presentation to us and to express how important I think it is that we do as much of this as we have time to do, bringing in experts from outside with other perspectives than our local community, since we are, as we've all expressed many times today, in such an exciting time of change. And I would like to thank you very much for coming, Mr. Walker. I'm so happy to have you here. I brought your book with me, hoping you will sign it after the presentation.
Thanks very much, Commissioner.
Just a quick question, if I may. So if we were to take a look at our TDP and that public engagement process, what would that look like really quickly if you were to run something like that?
You mean what would the process look like?
Yeah, the public engagement.
Well, I would encourage, the question, if I were you, the question I'd be asking ourselves now is, do we know what the public wants out of the money they've just spent? And do you feel like you have consistent direction from the public? Or is it more the sort of thing where these people thought we were doing this and those people thought we were doing that and have different ideas for the same money? If you don't feel like you have a clear message about that, such that enough of the public will come along with you as you move forward, then it may be appropriate to spend 6 months or so on a really good public conversation in which you help the public understand what the choices really are. You help them think about this at the outcome level and not just at the project level. And that can really help to start building a body of consensus among opinion leaders and so on. What we do with this when we're doing it is that we spend a lot of time working with your staff to figure out what the question is based on the decisions that will actually have to be made. Lead a conversation about outcomes that's expressed usually in a giant web survey, but also, of course, in other kinds of outreach methods. But another key thing we do are a lot of opinion leader kinds of workshops where we'll do workshops where we get the head of the university and the bank and the Chamber of Commerce and some of the key civil rights organizations and so on, get some key leaders around the table for 4 or 5 hours. I'll actually play a game with them. I'll put them all to work designing a transit network for a fictional city so that they have some of the hand knowledge of, not just brain knowledge about how it works. And then we'll get together to thinking about how we talk about these outcomes and what kinds of outcomes you want to measure. And that can then create a structure in which, and you can then debate those outcomes, form some views about them, and then the conversations about specific projects and plans happen in the context of having already thought about those things. And that can tend to make the individual conversations go more smoothly because then everyone remembers, oh yes, we talked about this. I remember we decided about this.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And thank you for being here, so I appreciate it very, very much. Interim CEO report.
Thank you, and I will be very brief. To the comment about public outreach and community outcomes, We were working on having a proposal brought back to this governing body at the next board meeting on our recommended approach to going out and getting this initiated. We do have the TDP that we completed the full update a year and a half ago, which was the basis of Mission Max. Obviously, we do need to relook at that. We need to refresh. We need to go out and really hold extensive and robust community engagement. So at the February board meeting, we'll have a recommendation of how staff is recommending to proceed. On top of that, I'll be very quick. We were the recipients of an FTA $800,000 grant for transit-oriented development, specifically for the streetcar expansion. That will be probably the primary discussion item for our TOD ad hoc, which we are scheduling for the end of this month, I believe on the 24th? The end of this month. Lena will give you the date. I'd also like to bring your attention to, we team with the Tampa Bay Foundation for Architecture and Design. Art on Heart. I had to say it real fast 10 times. We have a moving art display that we're unveiling on Wednesday at MTC downtown. I invite you to attend. You will see the press release for that. This week I do have a meeting, and I will report back to the chair with Mayor Lott in Plant City. As you may recall, the referendum clearly states that some of our transit funding from that sales tax will be used in the city of Plant City. Where that gets interesting is the fact that they are not part of our charter. So I will be talking with the mayor this week on exactly how we are going to plan to move service forward in Plant City. I will also be speaking at the Tampa Bay Partnership Transportation Working Group this week, along with Virgin Rail now, and some other high-level folks in our community about transportation, about what our plans are for moving forward now with the sales tax. It won't be any different than the presentation that you saw me do last month, which is very high-level planning. The paratransit audit that I promised you last year when I took this position that we would have conducted, that has been concluded. I have provided you the overview and the results of that. However, in March, we will have the consultant here to give you a full and robust discussion of the results of that audit. And with that, I conclude my...
Okay, thank you, sir. I don't have a report. Move the general counsel's report.
Briefly, with the incredible help of Lena Pettit, we have able to distill those questions. We'll have typewritten forms for the ad hoc committee to facilitate that process.
That's it. Thank you, sir. Okay, we now move into public comment regarding general concerns. We have the last two. First person is Janice Butler. Search committee.
Thank you. Good morning. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you all. I had an incident this morning, and I called yesterday. First of all, I hate, despise, and detest being late, and I apologize for being late this morning. I called yesterday to book for today, and the lady told me to she put all the information in, and she said, be ready 8:30, 8 o'clock, 8:30, be ready 8 o'clock. I said, for 9 o'clock pickup? She said, that's what the computer's telling me. I said, but I want to be there by 9 a.m. Well, I came in, about 9:30? So I even called this morning and double-checked that because I thought maybe the computer caught it and changed it, but that wasn't the case. And like I said, I detest being late. And the lady, she wasn't listening to me. She just wasn't listening. So you might want to bring that to the attention of when they have a supervisors meeting or something. for the dispatch, not the dispatchers, but for the people when you call in and they take your information. And the second thing is I had an incident with the yellow cab, 2.5 hours, I'm still waiting. I called my daughter, she even called the yellow cab and said, my mom is still waiting. I am on the other side of Brandon going to pick my daughter up from school. There is no way I can get to her. And I did call HART and I put in a formal complaint. And that's all I have to say, and thank you and Happy New Year.
Thank you, Ms. Butler, and Happy New Year to you also.
Thank
The
you.
last speaker is Bakari B. Bakari.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to first say, Ms. Donahue, I'll miss you. I appreciate everything. That you are actually one of the only members that made me feel welcome to come here. I just wanted to quickly say, the 360/60, I'm still disappointed in that corridor. I know that's a fairly new route, and as I knew you guys had to make some transitions in the service. However, as I mentioned to Brian the other day, there's no service there's no service that caters to the riders in the corridor of Falkenberg and 60. Nothing in that area. There was Hyperlink when they had Hyperlink, but no flex service. And as you know, there used to be like an H.H. Gregg there, Circus City, whatever. And then it was like a lot of other plazas, a lot of businesses up in that area. Even some new homes, apartment complexes and things like that. A plasma center that's very busy. No ridership. So you walk from Woodbury all the way down to 60 to get there. So when you took the route, even 360, going to Brandon Mall, that was kind of like about the same trip, about a half-a-mile trip from the mall down to Falkenberg. You took that away, and you ran it down Causeway straight out, and then you took 60 the other place, way further, another place to another park and ride. So just that service is that area is very desperate in need of some type of service up in there. 60 or Falkenberg, Falkenberg got 37 come down and it got left on Woodbury, but that little area needs something. Also, I was told there was going to be another plasma center opening up off of 301 and Fowler. And I remember I went over to the plaza to get a phone one day. I got off the 45, 42, one of those routes, the one you just brought back. And I rode my bike, 40. And I rode my bike all the way from like Moore's Bridge down in the rain. It was terrible. So anyways, there's no service there. If they're gonna open the center there, you're gonna really need service, I promise you. The 16 gets quite a bit of ridership because there's a plasma center on the corner of Armenia and Waters. So you're gonna need service there. There's gonna be a lot of riders. So I'm calling like, hey, we can't get there. They're gonna be like, it's gonna be crazy. So somehow that area is gonna need to be serviced. I'm glad to hear the Plant City is finally gonna be receiving service. I hope it's nothing like the last time. I hope it's a lot more robust. And that's just about it. Thank y'all. Have a wonderful night. Happy New Year.
Is there any old business? Any new business? Okay, I'm adjourned first. Any new business? Seeing none, we're adjourned. We're now going to move into the HART CEO potential candidates discussion. The members of that committee are myself, Mr. McLean, Ms. Harden, Ms. Shanahan, Mr. Knight left. We have to have an odd number because if we're doing a voting at an even number, the tie is a problem. So I'm going to appoint Ms. Williams to serve and as the other fifth person there. So you have myself, Mr. McLean, Ms. Harden, Ms. Williams, and Ms. Shanahan. So you're 5 minutes break.
Cataract surgery. Well, not really, but at the beginning of December, my
looked up the vent, it's right above us.
I'm sitting freezing myself. Very best my words, I'm on blood thinners.
Oh my goodness. I said, oh, I looked up the clock.
That would scare me more.
So hopefully you'll find a deal. Thank you so much. Congratulations to you as well. I wanted to give you a call at another time. Talk with you, is that okay?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, you go on.
Really?
Okay, so are you saying to me that we mean it?
Hello, we're going to call. If you can get your seats. If those are going to stay, get your seats, please. Hello.
Lena, did you get, are these
Mr. Chairman,
additional ones in
can I
this
stay
packet?
on
You
the
sent them.
seat?
Did you get the original one?
I don't have all of them. I was missing a few, so this one is the entire. Use this one. Use this one? Okay. Thank you.
I'm not on the committee.
I actually have looked into it ahead of time. And, but I didn't have all of the nominees, so this is good. I'll move this to the side.
I'm going to call the Executive Search Ad Hoc Committee meeting to order. Is there any public comment concerning this particular ad hoc committee? Any public comment? Any public comment? Seeing none. Review resumes and develop a list of candidates for the first round of interviews. Mr. Moser, welcome.
Morning, welcome. Thank you for having me. Morning. So I think the goal today is twofold. One is to review the resumes and or I should say three. One is to review the resumes. Two is to select a group of candidates to move forward for the next round. And three is to come up with a group of questions. And I think that Mr. Seward mentioned earlier that the goal of the next round is that we have a smaller group of candidates We ask them a series of 3 questions. They respond to those 3 questions in a video recorded interview, which will be provided to you. We come back and meet, reflect on those responses, and decide how to move forward from there. The goal of that is not to get answers to all of your questions. I think it would be impossible to do that with 3 questions, but the goal is to be able to get some more information so that you can make an effective decision to move forward with a final group of candidates to bring in, have an opportunity to meet with individually, and then have an opportunity to interview during your board meeting. So, Chair, I ask you, how would you like to go through the resumes? What manner would you like to use?
Let me ask this question. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the resumes? Okay. I don't know if we need to go through each resume right now, item by item. I think that we've had an opportunity to review them. I think at this point we need to just make a selection. And I would suggest, I've had the fortunate opportunity to chair 3 agencies when we got ready to hire a CEO. And I would suggest that we have no more than 4 candidates. You get above that, you got problems. 4 candidates should be probably the number we should be looking at. So at this point, sir, I would suggest that, I don't know how we do this, maybe we go to each member and let them decide on the 4 that they feel that they recommend and see what number they are there, and then go from there and see if we have a consensus on the 4 that we need to bring back. Does that work with you?
That works for me.
Okay. All right. Let's start with Mr. McLean.
Yeah. First off, I want to thank Greg personally for walking us through this process and providing this information to us. I'll just provide, I actually went down to 3. I thought the 3 was going to be a number, so I'll just give you my 3. And I had a set criteria I looked at all of the candidates with, and these are the ones that ranked out. I would go with number 1, and not in any order, Carrie Butler, Jacqueline Halldow, and Benjamin Limmer were the 3 that I looked at.
Anything else?
No, sir.
Okay. Mr. Harden.
I entered my list of 4, and it was Butler, Lee, Ferguson, and Limmer.
Butler, Lee, Ferguson,
and Limmer.
Okay. Ms. Shanahan.
I had Butler, Ferguson, Limmer, and Sproul.
Putnam, Ferguson, Limmer, and
William Sproul, the last name.
What am I missing here? Ms. Williams?
I had Benjamin, Limmer, Sproul, and Lee.
Okay, I guess I'm the last one. And I had Butler, Lee, Ferguson, and Limmer.
And since I provided 3, I'll extend it out to 4 and put Lee on there as my 4th.
Okay. So you had Butler, Lee, Ferguson, and Limmer?
No, I had Butler, Lee now, Holiday, and Limmer.
Okay.
I gave 3 as well.
Okay.
So to add to the 4th one is Ferguson.
Okay. So the way it looks to me, Butler had 4 votes. Limmer had 5. Ferguson had 4. Lee had 1, 2, 3, 4. Sprawl, well, hold on, only had 1.
2.
And 2? Where am I missing 1?
I had 1.
Okay, all right, right. And
Hadlow had 1.
Hallow had 1. So the 4 are Butler, Limmer, Ferguson, and Lee. Any objections? I'm going by what you said. Butler had 4, Limmer had 5, and Ferguson had 4, Lee had 4. So those will be the 4 top candidates.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Now to finalize the questions, you've been provided the questions, and I want to thank Mr. Smith and whomever else worked with you to get these questions down so fast.
Great job.
11 of them real quick like. Lena, you help with this? Let's see if we can get you a raise. Mr. Moser, how you want to handle this?
Well, so I'll give you a couple thoughts if that's okay, if that would work, and then we can reflect on these. I helped T-Barter with their recruitment, and we did the same sort of process. And one of the things I think worked well with the 3 questions that we asked them, they were very broad-based questions. And I can share with you a similar type of question, 3 types of questions for this. One of the things I typically find is if you lead a candidate in a certain area, you'll get an answer to that leaded area, right? If you talk about TOD or transit-oriented development or something like that, you're going to get a response specifically about that. So the broader these questions are, the more information and the more diversity to the answers you'll get from the different candidates. And as a result of that, maybe that'll give you better information to be able to assess them to bring that final group in. So if it's okay with you, I can just share my thoughts on 3 questions, and then we can open it up for discussion about how folks want to go. I listened to the questions you asked this morning, so I made a little bit of a back entry into each of these questions, but one was, please describe your leadership experience in the area, and I could go in within the areas of capital development, TOD, operations, and management of budgets, or we could leave that part out. And based upon your experience, why do you believe you're the most qualified candidate for this position? The next question I was going to say is, based on what you know taking place at HART today, there's been, there has never been a more critical and transformative time for HART. As a CEO, what will be your priorities for the agency, and how will you ensure that HART implements these priorities in an effective and equitable way? And the third question I thought of was, describe a project you have led. Was it successful or not, and what lessons did you learn from this project?
Any questions, additions, objections? Yes, ma'am.
I like those because I do think the point is being open-ended, so they give us their experiences, and if they hit the issues that we've raised in terms of the questions, you know, whether it be the management or the budget or human capital, how they're going to attract talent, all that stuff will come back and you'll understand what their priorities are without leading them to saying that's the number 1 or number 2 priority. So I like the way you framed them.
Mr. Clay.
Yeah, I also agree with that thought of Ms. Shanahan there. I think they're very broad-based questions. They'll allow them to expand and contract as they will. I think the questions we have in front of us, too, could be follow-on questions or questions asked out of different sessions.
Right.
Anyone else? Those are the 3? I'm sorry, Mr. Hart.
Yeah, and I think that your third question matches pretty well with the question Mr. Schisler put forward, which I liked a lot. I do think it would be interesting to have a question that delved into, you know, that really, you know, goes to their vision of how they would see the system expanding, and how they and or how they would see expanding the you know, back of house here, you know. And so I don't, you know, how do we I mean, maybe these questions are general enough that they'll be able to touch on that.
My guess is you won't get everything from these questions, but this will lead you to other questions, and to the point, I think that when you bring these candidates in for final interviews, you'll have this opportunity to ask many very specific questions to them.
So I have one more question, if I may,
Sure.
Ryan. So I guess William Sproul was, I know that you recommended that we limit the 3 questions to 4, and since they're not flying here and it's only 3 video questions, and I think Mr. Sproul had several supporters, would it be appropriate for you to consider adding him to the list of the person who would submit his 3 questions?
Mr. Sproul had 2 votes.
Okay, so was he was then in 5th place?
He would, if we went to 5, which believe me, you go above 4, you got problems. And I think Mr. Moser we talked about one time 3. I believe one time we talked about 3, and I convinced him to go with 4. I think 5 would go over. Yeah, I think we need to stick with 4.
That works.
Shannon.
Can we see, I mean, so with specificity to the questions, because you sort of just talked vaguaries, I mean, I do think it's important to cover the concept that our speaker addressed and that I think several board members addressed about, you know, leadership vision in a transformative agency on an ascendancy of budget, something like that, that you're going to get to some specifics, but they understand, you know, what our, they understand the transition, which they should, doing their own research, but it gives them the broad enough ability to sort of talk across a landscape of issues, and we can then prioritize what we think their experience is. So I think it's, I don't, you know, when we did this before for T-BARTA, we saw the exact questions. We're sort of leaving it in your hands, it sounds like, but I don't know that, I want to make sure everybody here understands that.
I'm more than happy to send them to you as the ad hoc committee so you can review the question. I can put it down in an email to you.
Great.
Any other questions, any concerns?
Question, I'm not on the committee, but are the applicants going to see these questions in advance, or do you spring them on them?
I think that, well, I think if it's possible they're listening or watching the meeting today, so they would have an opportunity to hear that. But I think the goal is that I provide you these probably within the next hour or 2 on an email so you can review them quickly, respond back if it looks okay or if there's any changes. And I think that once we do that, I'd like to get these available to them, if not today, then first thing tomorrow, because the goal is to give them about 5 days to respond to these questions. So there's not a long period of time for them to be able to turn this back around for you to have them available on the 14th.
Mr. Menendez is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, thank you, Greg, for the sample questions. I think, given that they were posed to T-BARTA, I think that, and this can come at a time if there are additional questions, but your second question I thought was good, and you noted it's a critical time, what are your priorities? I think at some point, whether it's in that question or in a follow-up, I'd like to see what challenges they anticipate and how they'll address them. So not just priorities, but also, you know, thank you.
Ms. Williams.
Thank you. In regards to the commitment to stay with HART for 5 years, I know that was mentioned earlier in our board meeting. Is that a prerequisite that we're asking ahead of the questions here?
You know, I've had conversations with all the candidates. I don't think in any agency, whether it's HART or anyone, it puts an agency in a good position to not have a goal of at least being there for 5-7 years. I mean, obviously you don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I think that all of these candidates I've talked to have a commitment to serve for at least that period of time, have a commitment to work that long or to be with the agency if all things are going well. So it's something I vetted as I had a conversation with the candidates, but certainly I would encourage you to ask them when you bring them in person.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions or concerns you need to bring forth today? So the process now, Mr. Moser, where are we now?
So I am going to sit down and type up these questions. I will email them to the ad hoc committee so you can review them. I will get them to you shortly. And like I said, we want to turn this around and make this available to the candidates, if not later today, then tomorrow. So the goal is for them, they're going to respond back. Each question, we're going to allow 3 minutes. They will have the opportunity to record that, submit a response to each of those questions. I think that the goal is we're going to come back together on the 14th to review their responses. You'll have received those ahead of time. So my goal is to give them about 5 days to finish this, and then to be able to share these with you so you can review them. And then we'll meet back on the 14th to review these and decide which of these, whether it's all of them or a smaller subset of that group, moves forward for a final interview, and again, Mr. Stewart talked about having opportunity for each of you to meet with those candidates individually, meet with those candidates as a formal interview process in a public session. And then I will also continue to do diligence, as I mentioned, many of you, I've done diligence on these candidates. I will continue to do that. And once we get to that final stage, we'll do formal background checks and all of those sorts of things as well.
Okay, so committee, we have another meeting on the 14th, I think at 10:30, if I'm not mistaken. Is it 10:30? Meeting on the 14th?
It's immediately after Finance Committee.
Finance Committee meets at 9?
9, yes.
Okay. So thereafter, so 9, I'll say 10:30, at least be here by 10:30 if you're not on the Finance Committee. Okay. Any other questions, concerns for Mr. Moses or anyone else? Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
There's nothing else, we'll adjourn.
Immediately.